think the international order is changing. We are in a phase of interregnum. We are past the point of unipolarity, of US hegemony, that's for sure. The United States continues to be the most powerful country, but it has become increasingly less effective at shaping the agenda in multilateral institutions like the WTO, like the United Nations, and so on.
Welcome to In Network. I'm Olivia Prisco, Digital Design and Experience Intern. Today, we're joined by a very special guest, Dr. Zeno Leoni. Dr. Leoni is a lecturer in Defence Studies at King's College London within the UK's Defence Academy. He frequently advises policymakers both in Italy and the UK and regularly contributes to media discussions across outlets such as the BBC, Rai Radio, The Guardian, The Financial Times, and the South China Morning Post. He is also the author of 2 books, Grand Strategy and the Rise of China Made in America, and America Grand Strategy from Obama to Trump, Imperialism After Bush and China's Hegemonic Challenge. So, without further ado, Dr. Leoni, welcome.
Thank you, Olivia. It's a pleasure to be here, and greetings to all the members and the audience of In Network.
Okay, so to start off, we've touched on your career at high levels, but I'd love to begin more personally. Beyond these titles and institutions, what experience or moments have shaped the way you think about international politics today?
Thank you. Well, I would start by perhaps why I began this journey. And I think it has to do a lot with Italian history, especially during the Cold War and its relationship with the United States, with an hegemonic power. And I think this is what got me interested in international affairs in first instance, trying to understand more of this relationship, which in reality I never got to study. And I eventually, talking about what events shaped my views, my interest, eventually I started to become more interested in US-China relations, this sort of hegemonic competition between the two most powerful countries. I'm not entirely sure whether there is a specific events in the context of this relationship, which you mentioned my book, and clearly who is listening us today realize that this is my core business, US-China relations, among many other things, but really this is my core business when it comes to research. I think there have been many intriguing developments in the last 15 years, from Obama's pivot to Asia to more recent events nowadays. So it's been a series of moments in recent history.
Yeah, I myself am quite very passionate about the topic, and this actually leads me to my next question. As I am currently writing my dissertation about the war on terror, I have stumbled upon this very important term, which is a grand strategy. It often appears in policy debates, but it's not always clearly understood outside academic circles. So how would you define grand strategy, and why is it such a critical concept for understanding global politics today?
Thank you for the question. First of all, you mentioned 9/11, and speaking of moments in life, obviously, like a lot of people, I remember very well that day, although it was still a bit far from the beginning of my academic journey. It was probably 10 years before that or more, the start of my PhD. A bit more than that, actually. In terms of grand strategy, I was actually reflecting on this earlier on as I'm trying to compare how US grand strategy and Chinese grand strategy have developed over the decades. So there are different schools of thought. There is the classic, more sort of classic traditionalist school of thought, which identifies grand strategy as something that is in the military realm, in the military sphere. But this is a very narrow definition of grand strategy. And then there's other scholars who take a more global politics perspective, and they see grand strategy as, again, like the traditionalist, as the bridge in between ends, ways, and means, but beyond the military sphere. So thinking in terms of other means, even economic means, but also grand strategy is about thinking about a stable world order, thinking what happens after the war in the long term, thinking about maintaining peace. So there is that. There are other ways of looking at grand strategies as a process. Some people say as a plan, as principles. In my opinion, so I can answer the question, grand strategy, and I mentioned ends, ways, and means. So for me, it's mostly about the ends.
Okay.
So when we think about grand strategy, we need to think about what is grand, because we know what is strategy, but what is that makes strategy grand? It is the ends. So, and to be more concrete, it is where a country sees itself in the international order nowadays, what role this country wants to play, but also where that country sees itself in 20 years' time, 30 years' time. And just to answer the second part of your question, I think there are benefits in taking a grand strategic perspective, because it helps you to see the big picture, especially nowadays with everything that is going on with the Trump administration. Trump is clearly making headlines. But if we focus exclusively on daily statements of political leaders, we really struggle to see that often there is more continuity than discontinuity. But anyway, Trump's aside, in general, it helps you thinking about the big picture. And this is absolutely vital. We cannot talk about international affairs without thinking about the big picture.
Yes, I most definitely agree, especially sometimes I also notice in some analysis and just common debates we have between peers of international relations. Oftentimes, we tend to focus on specific events without, for example, contextualizing them or considering just a few other factors, whether it's the military, whether it's the social, whether it's the economic. And so I completely align with what you're saying. And if we look specifically at the US and China, how would you describe their core differences in their grand strategy? Are they competing? Are there some similarities maybe?
Yes, so I think, first of all, we need to say that these two countries are in very different stages of development, not economic development, but thinking about grand strategy. So two different moments in their history, in their trajectory. So the United States, for the first 150 years of its history, was expanding more and more, was expanding its military and political influence as its economic interests were growing globally. And then World War II, was a watershed, from which the United States managed to project its influence from the Western Hemisphere to the whole of the international order, or almost the whole of the international order. China is in a different stage. China looks more like the United States before World War II than after World War II. China is going through different stages, growing its interest in the global economy, growing its influence, but it's still a very cautious player. China is a country that is not leading yet. China is very influential, and yet it stays away from many crises, and we saw this again with the crisis in Iran. it stays away from many summits, or it has its own agenda. It doesn't want to get involved in global affairs too much. I think that's an important difference between the two trajectory of the United States, of these two countries, essentially.
Yes, I've actually recently written an article about China and the Strait of Hormuz, and I've read this article from the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, and the headline struck me because it said that basically Beijing doesn't think like Washington, and China kind of deliberately avoids alliance-style commitments, preferring flexible partnerships. And the interesting thing about this article is that it said that the current conflict in Iran clearly demonstrates this. So from what you're saying, I guess that you're kind of aligned with what the article says.
I totally agree. I think there are, obviously, there is never one reason, or sometimes there is one reason, but we could see different reasons. Then it's difficult to say what reason is prevailing, what factor is more important, is the most important one. But anyway, China doesn't do, there is the fact that China doesn't do alliances. So that's a problem if you want to intervene overseas and you don't have alliances. There is a cautious approach to foreign policy, but there is also the complexity of the Middle East and the fact that China has very important, Iran is a very important partner of China, but also the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And I would say that politically, in the long term, Iran might be a more important partner. But at the moment, perhaps Saudi Arabia, the Gulf are more important than Iran for China. So it's not just the fact that China doesn't do alliances, but or Chinese strategic culture, which is very pragmatic one, but there is also the complexity of the region. There is also the fact that China cannot project power so far from China militarily, especially, now I'm saying something that is absurd at the moment, but what could China do? Send its assets and prevent the US and Iran from attacking, and Israel from attacking Iran. It seems unthinkable and really unlikely to happen, because China would struggle to project a lot of power so far from home.
Yeah. I mean, this is where geography plays a really critical role in international relations, and with this conflict, we are seeing this even more at play. Always remaining on the same topic of US-China relationship, many analysts describe this relationship as the defining competition of the 21st century. Do you see it primarily as a strategic rivalry, an ideological competition, or something else, or maybe a mix of both?
So, first of all, I thought it was going to be the defining relationship for this century. As I mentioned at the start of this talk, it's what got me interested in doing a PhD. But it's, I don't know, I was going to say hilarious or tragic, the fact that ultimately we are all, our attention always, at least in our lifespan, in our generation, it seems to we are always dragged to the Middle East. We are always dragged to Eastern Europe. There are a lot of tension in the Western Pacific, but sometimes you get the feeling that the United States and China do not want to go to war with each other. And we look at the past few decades and we see, and even in recent years, we see a lot of escalations and de-escalation. So my argument is that I call this relationship an economy security conundrum. So where essentially the US and China disagree on many things, also ideologically, although it's not anymore like the Cold War, and they compete, but at the same time they need to cooperate from an economic point of view. Other colleagues call this co-petition. So the fact that in this relationship there is both cooperation and competition at the same time. And it's true that it has become more competitive, the relationship, in recent years, but we still see a lot of signs of cooperation. Just a few days ago, I was reviewing a book proposal from some colleagues from the US who would like to write about how the states in the US, California, Florida, Indiana, how there are different local actors who want to cooperate with China or who need to cooperate with China, while the national government is competing with China. So it's we live in this globalized economic order, which it's almost a trap in the sense that the two countries have to coexist no matter what. Sometimes it feels like that.
And out of curiosity, do you think that also the nukes play a role in this?
So it's interesting because not so much. And you mentioned ideology before, and it's similar. So
Okay.
these are two areas which are different compared to the Cold War. And speaking of ideology, clearly the US and China have two different political cultures. But it's not the ideological confrontation that we used to have during the Cold War. Thinking about nukes as well, I don't think this has been part of the equation until now. It's more, you can see that more people, more analysts, the Pentagons are talking about it. But in my opinion, especially the problem for the United States is not one where China could destroy the United States physically, which was the issue during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But the main issue is that China, and no matter what, but China is a big country where a lot of people live with an Asian capitalist model. It's resource intensive. So this puts a lot of pressure on the United States, where people try to have a highly consumerist American way of life. In other words, it feels like from an economic point of view, the world is too small for these two countries, for these two, big populations. And clearly there is going to be competition for resources. There is going to be competition for markets. So that's the tragedy in a way. It's regardless of whether the US and China are good players or bad players, it doesn't matter. It's a fact that these two countries will have to compete, and it's not so much about the nukes for now.
That's actually interesting, especially with the comparison of the Cold War. In a lapse of time, things have really reshuffled in a way that many possibly historians at the time of the Cold War wouldn't have imagined. And remaining last point on this US-China, what do you think policymakers or also the audience, public, what do you think they often misunderstand about Washington and what they misunderstand about China?
That's a good question. I'll start from China because it's easier. I think so. I think there's been a big misunderstanding about China for many decades, which is the fact that China was going to change politically internally. And when I say this, I mean, to become a pluralist democracy in the same way that we have it in Europe, for instance. This is absolutely possible. And there have been moments in China's history, especially in the early 20th century, where potentially this could have happened. But generally speaking, a pluralist democracy is not in the genes of China. So it's not surprising that there is, one party, the Communist Party of China, leading the country. And in a way, we could see that just as another dynasty. About the United States, well, I could say many things. I think sitting from here, from the UK, I think one thing that we perhaps misunderstood um, was the fact that, so we always assume that we knew about the United States. We always think that China is an unknown entity and that the United States is a well-known entity because, for obvious reasons, cultural similarities, people-to-people exchanges, and so on and so forth. But actually, the United States is a very, I would put it this way, a very complex country, especially from a socially and culturally. And I think some of the challenges are coming to the fore. I guess that's the way they say it in English. So it's important to study the United States as much as we study China. And I'm saying this because normally when journalists call me, they ask me about China, not about the US. And also you look at how many modules in universities there are about US foreign policy, and there are very few in the UK or in Europe. So, but actually it's important to study the United States. It's still the most powerful country in the world. So we need to get to know it very well.
And referring to what you said about the social complexity of the US, do you think it's an inherent characteristic, or there's also, presidents may amplify this thing? Is it like something it's on a continuum, or presidents may actually accentuate this?
The president, you said?
Yeah, presidents.
The president.
Yeah. President.
No, I think the US went through a civil war, a very quite brutal civil war, not too long ago, talking about the big picture and long-term perspective. No, I think it's there are contradictions in the United States, which probably have disappeared for many decades, or at least we were not seeing them, because the United States experienced an absolutely unique, remarkable historically wave of economic development. And no matter what, you might have all sorts of problems, but when things look good, when the economy it's growing fast, it's easier to maintain domestic stability. That's for every country. And I believe that with the crisis of globalization and the internal socioeconomic crisis in the United States, where there are people who find challenging navigating everyday life from an economic point of view, these contradictions are becoming more evident.
We often hear that the international order is changing or fragmenting. In your view, are we witnessing the decline of the current order? Is it an evolution?
So some people say that there is a debate on the crisis of the liberal international order. Some people say that in reality we need to think about whether it's a US hegemonic crisis. Because even if, let's say, the US becomes a very inward-looking country, it disappears from the international scenes, it becomes as inward-looking as North Korea, let's say. A lot of the liberal features of the international order will still be there, starting from diplomacy, multilateral fora, summits where head of states meet and exchange ideas and cooperate. I find it a bit of a overly institutionalist interpretation. So it emphasizes the form of the order rather than the substance. I think the international order is changing. We are in a phase of interregnum. We are past the point of unipolarity, of US hegemony, that's for sure. The United States continues to be the most powerful country, but it has become increasingly less effective at shaping the agenda in multilateral institutions like the WTO, like the United Nations, and so on. And that's why we're seeing the rise of so many regional agreements, so many minilateral agreements, minilateral groups, because this has become a more viable way for the United States or for other countries to pursue their interests. Because on a global level, it's just too difficult because the international order, it is fragmented.
Yes, I was actually thinking about Ray Dalio. I read one of his books, The Principles of a Changing World Order, and it aligns with what you say because essentially he identifies a pattern in history with all of hegemonic powers, also looking at past, especially looking at past empires like the British, and essentially he identifies this trend. There is a rise, and then there is a peak, and then there is a decline. And following his predictions based on the extensive studies he has conducted, according to his principles, technically we are witnessing a US slow decline, and we are witnessing instead the rise of China, and we are simply waiting for the moment in which the two curves intersect and one takes a new power. And it's actually quite interesting, and something which came to my mind as you were speaking.
That's fascinating reading. I think I really like Antonio Gramsci's
Mm.
statement on the interregnum, which has been in English is usually translated in this way. Now we'll probably get it wrong, but it's so the old order is dying, and the new order is yet to be born.
Mm.
This is the time of monsters. That's how it has been translated. And right now, for me, the monsters, for instance, it might be the uncertainty.
Mm.
And there is uncertainty because clearly we see some changes in US foreign policy. But we, at the same time, we still have the Cold War institutions still there. The NATO, for instance, it's still there. But then we see the rise of new institutions, we see the rise of new players. But as we said before, China is really not ready or not showing any intention of wanting to replace the United States. So that's the interregnum, a time of uncertainty where it's unclear it's less clear what are the power structures, what is the hierarchy in the international order.
Yeah. I mean, I remember giving a presentation at King's about this, and I myself focused a lot on the keyword of uncertainty, and I totally agree with your analysis. I mean, but however, I think of this point. I mean, uncertainty is kind of a defining characteristic of the world order, even when there is a hegemon which provides more stability and predictability. I would actually argue that still, given the nature of relations, it's always going to be unpredictable. The extent of it, that could of course either go up or down, but yes,
Yeah, and I think there's been I agree there's always unpredictability, and I think media are kind of overstating
Mm.
this sort of unpredictability that we have seen in the last year. Certainly, there is more unpredictability, but if we look at the last 100 years, we went through so much in terms of international history. So that's why, going back to your previous question, it's always healthy to think about the big picture, and think in long term, from a long term perspective.
And one of my final questions is some commenters have gone as far to say that these new rising tensions with the war might trigger something bigger, a wider
Mm.
global conflict. What are your predictions?
So until recently, I wrote a paper on geopolitical blocks, and actually the concern behind the paper was exactly that the crisis in Ukraine, tensions in Taiwan, tensions in the Middle East, at some point will become one crisis where countries are aligned on one side or the other. But actually, I had to revise this statement, this theory, and this is why we see. This is why then I developed this idea of soft geopolitical blocks, which means that there are geopolitical blocks. They contrapose each other, but alignment is not formal enough yet. What do I mean by this? For example, Russia and Iran, they have an important military partnership which was signed 1 year ago, but it doesn't involve mutual defense, for instance. So I don't think we will see Russia rushing to rescue Iran. China is the same. We discussed this before. China has many partners and do not want to commit to and cannot commit to this sort of conflicts. The European powers are being quite cautious at this moment, and there's a more fragile relationship with the United States. So everything is slightly more fluid than I thought it was 2 years ago. And so although I'm very worried, I don't worry anymore about a World War III where one side, I don't know, the West fights a Eurasian bloc in Ukraine, in the Middle East, or in Taiwan. I think that would be an exaggeration to argue so. So I'm not worried about that. But of course, everything that is going on, it's worrying in itself.
And before we close, if there is one insight you would want our audience to take away from this conversation about grand strategy or global competition, what would it be?
Oh my God, this is a very, very difficult question. No, perhaps I can. Surely, some people who are listening to this podcast one day want to be academics, perhaps, or not. They might be policymakers. I really want to invite everyone to always think in terms of the big picture. Also, because especially if you are an academic, we need to try to think intellectually about what's going on. And of course, microanalyzing is important sometimes. And we always need to match the big picture, which is up here, with more specific events on the ground. But we need to always be intellectual about understanding the world, and only thinking in terms of the big picture, we can do that.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Zeno Leoni. It was a privilege to interview you. And on behalf of InNetwork, a big thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. I was impressed by the very engaging, very interesting questions and tough questions that you asked me. So thanks for having me.
Thank you.